Now we're going to be talking about another tool that we use to put details on or do final shaping on pieces of material that you might incorporate into your project. And this is a router, okay? Now this is a router table, and the actual router itself is sitting suspended from a plate that's flush with the surface of the table. Now you could think of this as a shaper. We do have a large 5-horsepower shaper in here, but this tool is so portable and it's so easy to switch out the bits that we have a tendency to use this a lot more than any other tool in the shop for these shaping purposes. Okay, now the first thing I want to do whenever I'm working with the router, I'm going to show you how to change the bit out. I'm going to show you what the bits are for and how to use them safely. The first thing we want to do is unplug the tool. Okay, here's the power cord. So I want to make sure that that baby's unplugged, because if this comes on while I've got my hands anywhere near the bit, I'm going to be hamburger. Okay? Now the deal is that these tools usually have handles mounted on them like this, and you can use them as portable routing tools. In other words, I could do shaping on the edges of a workpiece that was on a bench if I like. But because this table provides so much more surface to work on, it's a lot safer and a lot stabler and a lot more accurate and consistent to be working on the router table as often as possible, as opposed to using this tool as a portable tool. So right now I've got a bit in here. I don't know if you can see it, and we'll show you these bits a little bit closer up in a while. But I've got a bit in here that'll put a round edge on the corner of a piece of wood. But that's not what I'm going to show you how to use the router for first. So we're going to take this bit out of the router, and you need to pay really close attention to taking these things out and putting them back in, because the way you put them back in is a safety factor in the use of the tool. So to get this bit out of here, the first thing I want to do is take the base of the router off. So I open the cam lock, and then I spin this base off of here and put it aside. You can see there's a nut on this collar or collet area that's holding that bit in. So I need a couple of wrenches to get that off. The wrenches for this tool live right underneath the router table. They're hanging on a nail, and as soon as I'm done with them, I'm going to put them back right there so that we always know where they are. To remove a bit from the router, you take the base off, take the router, put it on the table in front of you, facing away from you. Take your wrenches, they're both the same size. There's 2 nuts on here that lock together. Okay? Put your first wrench on the inside nut on your right side. Okay? Hold it there with your left hand. Take your other wrench, put it on the outside nut. Okay? Apply a little pressure so you can let go with your left hand, let go of that inner wrench with your left hand, and grab the router body, and then push down on that outer wrench. Okay? That's going to pop that outer nut loose. I spin that out until it stops. Okay? There's a snap ring there, and I push it one more time. It pops that bit loose. Okay? Usually it pops it loose. Okay? There we go. So we've got the bit out of there. Now I want to show you what it was captured in is what we call a collet. This is a piece of spring steel that's got a wedge shape on the bottom. The collet in the tool is also wedge shaped. When you put this collet in there and screw it down, it closes down on the bottom of the shank of the tool. Okay? Now you notice that hole there is the same size as the shaft of the cutter bit. This is a 1/4-inch collet. So we're going to change this out so we can perform the operation I want to show you initially. Okay, we've got our flush cutting bit that we're going to trade out. We had a round over bit in the router. We took that one out. Now there's a difference not only in the configuration of these tools, but in the shaft diameter. This is a 1/2-inch shaft. This is a 1/4-inch shaft. This is a 1/4-inch collet. Okay? So what am I going to need to install this in the tool? It's not going to sit in there like that by itself. I'm going to grab my little box of collets that lives in the bit box. and get out a 1/2 inch shank collet. I'm going to put the 1/4 inch back. I'm also going to put the 1/4 inch bit back in the box where it belongs. Okay, so now we're going to install this router bit in the router. I take the appropriate diameter collet and I spin it down into the router until it just barely hits bottom. Don't tighten it at all. Just find the bottom and maybe back off a 1/4 turn. So again, you spin it down lightly, hits bottom, back it off just a little bit. We're going to install the bit in the tool. It goes all the way in. Okay? When it hits bottom, you pull it back out a 1/16 to an 1/8 of an inch. So the vibration of the tool won't force the bit out while you're running it. Okay? So we've got the bit in the tool. Again, we lay the router down on the table facing away from us. We take the wrenches, whereas when we were taking the bit out, they were on your right-hand side. When you're installing the bit, the wrenches go on the left-hand side. Your first wrench goes on the inner nut on the left hand. Hold it there with your right. Your other wrench goes on the outer nut. Once you put a little pressure on it, grab the tool and apply some pressure. Now you don't have to put your full weight down on this. You just want to snug it up so it's nice and firm. Okay? Otherwise you'll never get that nut open again. It's in there nice and firmly. The wrenches go back where they belong. They hang underneath the table. You don't leave them lying on the table. You don't put them here. You don't put them on a horse. You don't put them on a bench. You hang them back up underneath the router table. We've got our bit installed in the body of the router. We're going to put the base plate back on. Okay, now you can see when I spin this, the bit protrudes more and more and more. That's how we adjust our depth of cut. Now when we talk about the table saw or the chop saw or the joiner, we're always talking about keeping our work down against the table and up against the fence. Well, where's our fence? Here's our table. That bearing becomes our fence. So it's down against the table and up against the bearing. Okay? We want to adjust for depth of cut. Now I happen to know what project we're working on, and I'll show you how we're going to adjust for depth of cut. We've got a template here that we use to establish a shape in a piece of stock. Now I made this template out of 1/4 inch plywood, and I'm going to apply it to the 3/4 inch working stock. I'm going to secure it to the working stock, and I'm going to smooth the edges of the working stock up to exactly the same shape as the template. Okay? So what I'm going to be working with is the 3/4 inch working stock and the 1/4 inch template secured to the top of it, and we'll do that in a moment. But to set the depth of cut for the tool, I want the bearing riding on the template. This bearing and this template are going to dictate the final shape of the working stock. Okay? So here we go. We're turning this back up until that bearing is riding on the template, and the cutter is going to cut the working stock. So I've got my depth of cut. I lock it down. I drop the base plate and the router into the router table, okay, making sure that the base plate is flush with the router table, and I check one more time for my depth of cut. If I have to readjust, I can always come down here and adjust from underneath the table and turn the body of the router instead of the base plate to adjust for the depth of cut. So what I've got here is a little nail gun. Okay? So we'll give you a little lesson about the nail gun while we're talking about the router. I've also got some little nails. Now technically this is called a brad nailer. We call it a pin nailer around here. And I've got a string of brads here that are just long enough to secure that 1/4 inch template down to that working stock. You can put up to 1.5 inch pins in this pin nailer, but if I use pins that long, they'd come out through the bottom of the stock. Okay? So we'll get this out of the way. To open the brad nailer, you want to make sure it's not plugged into its air supply, because this is a pneumatic tool. push the button on the back, let the slide come open, take your pins and put them down in the bottom of the slide area and slide them all the way forward, and then shut the tool. And then shut the tool. And then shut the tool. Okay? It locks in place. Okay? There's a safety pin on here, or a safety guard on this. The gun won't fire if that's sticking out. So when you put that guard against the work, then you can fire the gun. Okay, now when we plug this thing in, we don't want it pointing at anybody or anything. So I've got the air hose, I've got the gun, I'm not pointing it at anybody, I'm not holding it like this, and I probably don't want to point it right at the ground, because if a pin fires accidentally, it might bounce up and get me. So I plug that guy in like that. Okay. Now in this particular case, the template is exactly as wide as the working stock, and it's squared up on the bottom. So I just square the corners of the template up to the stock, making sure I've got a little material sticking out all the way around, because that's what I'm going to shave off to make this working stock completely symmetrical. Hold the template down where I want it and fire the gun. Now the reason I put this handle on the template is that when I'm running this piece past the router head, I want to be able to hold on to my working assembly. Okay? Without the handle on there, you have a tendency to grab things around the edges like this. And I don't want to make hamburger out of the ends of my fingers. Okay? So I've got this handle that I can go through the whole range of the cut without having to get my fingers down anywhere near the blade. I want you to pay really close attention to the rate of speed and the sound of the tool as we're going through the cut, because you regulate the speed of your feed by the sound of the tool. So I'm going to plug ourselves back in. When I plug us in, I don't want the working stock anywhere near the blade in case the tool comes on accidentally. So I'm not anywhere near the blade. I plug myself in. Okay. Now the router bit itself is spinning in a counterclockwise direction when it's sticking up through the table. Spinning in a counterclockwise direction. So I always want to feed my work into the cut like this. That gives me control. The pressure of the cut regulates the speed of the feed and the control I have over it. If this blade is spinning this way and I bring my work past it in this direction, it could grab and shoot out. That'd be like a kickback. So when you're making a cut on the router table, you want to make sure that there's nobody in the way in case you do lose this piece and it goes off like that. You're fairly safe. What might happen is it'd kick you and get you in the groin. That would be a little painful, but you might lose the work piece. Okay? So we're going to feed against the direction of the cut. So now if you can see, that working stock is absolutely flush with the template. And if we have established a completely symmetrical template with nice fair lines on it that's all smoothed out and it's exactly the shape that we want our working piece to be when it's done, then we've been able to reproduce that work piece exactly the same shape as a template. This is a great technique for production work. If I wanted to reproduce 10 of these or 20 of these or 50 of these, I have a template that'll dictate the final shape of the work. Okay? This particular shape we're using for the ends of our toolboxes, you're only going to have to do 2 of them, but it's a good way to learn some of the production techniques of establishing patterns and templates to use to cut other objects. Okay? So we'll finish the cutoff here. There's a few things that you have to pay attention to. When you're working with wood, all wood has grain. And you can see in this particular piece, the grain of the wood is all traveling in this direction, up and down. Okay? Now when we make this cut and the the bit is spinning in this direction and we're moving past the bit like that, you can see that all the end grain is coming out in this direction. As we pass up over the top of the work, then you're cutting across the grain. You see the grains coming up like this? You're cutting across the grain. So whereas this way you were slicing the grain off downhill, you got the grain sticking up like this, you're trying to chop the heads off of the grain. It gets a little tougher up here. Now as we come down this side of the work, when I finish the cut, we've got the grain going in this direction. You're cutting against that end grain. There's a possibility that you can split this grain out. Okay? That's why you don't want a lot of meat sticking outside of your template. The router will cut it, but it might chew it up, it might tear it up. So you want to remove as little as possible with the router bit so that you get a nice clean cut. Now we're going to complete the cut and see what happens when we get down to this corner with this grain sticking out like this. There's a good possibility we'll split that out. Now there are ways to avoid it. I could cut that corner off with the bandsaw so it's a little more rounded so the router bit wouldn't tear it off. Or I could sand that corner off, but I'm going to leave it and see if it tears it out so you can see exactly what happens. So here we go to complete the cut. Make sure the material's not anywhere near the cutting tool. Turn it on. Down against the table and up against the bearing. Nice and smooth, exactly the same shape as a template. Now you'll notice as I came around the corner, it didn't tear that corner out like we were worried about, but it did remove some material. And that's because I had the working stock protruding outside the template. We are flush on this side. So in other words, my working stock was a little bit wider than my template. If you're working to precise dimensions and you want everything to go together, then you have to make sure that either your template or your working stock is exactly the right size to come up with the part that you need.